At the selection event for the $10 million Red Hollow 500 in Nevada, CEO Savannah Drake laughed out loud when Cade Whitaker, a 39-year-old single father, pulled up in a car he had bought for $500 from a salvage yard. She turned him away in front of the cameras, called it a scrap pile that would not survive 5 miles of desert sand. Cade did not argue. He only asked for one chance to run. And when that battered car screamed across the test strip and left 3 of Savannah's million-dollar machines sitting on the shoulder, every person at that event went quiet. Nobody knew what Cade had hidden under the hood. Stay until the end, because the $500 car did not just win the race. It dismantled every assumption that money builds better than knowledge. The registration tables at the Red Hollow 500 selection event stretched across 300 feet of Nevada asphalt, and every inch of them gleamed under a sky so blue it looked painted, flanked by $400,000 machines draped in sponsor logos and fresh custom livery, surrounded by crew members in matching uniforms who moved with the practiced confidence of people who had never once worried whether their equipment would start. 41 teams had registered for the most brutal desert race in North America, a 500-mile gauntlet across dry lake beds, volcanic rock fields, and canyon cuts that had swallowed engines whole for 22 consecutive seasons. The prize was $10 million, and the people gathered here to compete, for it wore that number on their faces like a birthright. Camera crews panned across matte black hoods and titanium roll cages. Commentators narrated the arrival of factory-backed contenders with the reverence of the clergy, and the whole spectacle had the polished momentum of money breeding more money, until a sun-faded pickup rolled into the lot, towing a trailer with a single desert runner that looked like it had been assembled from regret. Cade Whitaker stepped out of the cab and stretched his back the way a man does when he has been driving since before sunrise, worn boots hitting the pavement, hands already moving toward the toe straps out of habit. He was 39 years old and built like someone who had spent those years working rather than decorating the idea of working, wide through the shoulders, a little deliberate in the way he moved, the kind of quiet that was not shyness but economy. His truck was the same color as the desert. His jacket had a small hole near the left cuff. He untied the trailer straps without looking at them, backed the car down the ramp on his own, and only then looked up at the lineup of machines surrounding him with the mild expression of a man assessing a job rather than entering a performance. The car he had brought was called Dustfall, though no one here knew that yet. Its body panels were scratched and sun-bleached. A door on the passenger side was slightly caved from an old impact that had been straightened but never refinished, and the windshield had a hairline crack in the lower corner that had been sealed with precision resin but remained visible if you looked. Alongside the gleaming machines on either side of it, Dustfall looked less like a competitor than a cautionary tale. People noticed. The noticing was immediate and collective, a kind of ambient amusement that rippled through the registration zone without anyone deciding to start it. Savannah Drake noticed it too, and she was not the kind of person who left that sort of energy unsharpened. She was the CEO of Drake Velocity Racing, 44 years old, the kind of polished and purposeful that came from a childhood where failure had consequences and success had cameras, and she ran her operation with the conviction that image was not separate from performance but identical to it. She was standing near the Drake Velocity trailer when one of her crew members pointed out the $500 car, and she walked over with the relaxed authority of someone who already knew the outcome of most conversations before they began. She looked at the car for a moment, then looked at Cade, then allowed herself a small public laugh that her crew understood as permission to do the same. She asked him whether he had come in from the wrong direction, meaning the junkyard. She said it in front of 2 broadcast cameras and a cluster of journalists, the timing too smooth to be accidental. She told the small crowd forming around her that the Red Hollow 500 was a race that required professional-grade equipment, serious financial commitment, and the kind of institutional experience that protected both drivers and the integrity of the event itself, and that a car purchased for $500 from a salvage lot was none of those things. She called it a scrap pile wearing racing numbers. She said it not cruelly exactly, but with the casual authority of someone drawing a boundary they had drawn many times before and had never been required to defend. Cade listened without changing his expression. When she finished, he said that his car had been rebuilt to meet every technical standard the event required, and he was asking for a fair inspection, not a favor. Savannah told him that documentation and reality were different things, that the selection committee had the right to evaluate suitability on multiple criteria, and that showing up with something that looked like it belonged in a demolition exhibit was not a neutral act. She turned away before he could respond, which was its own kind of answer. Two of the registration staff redirected Cade toward a secondary holding area, politely but without ambiguity. A few of the nearby crews had gone back to their own preparations, but a few more were still watching, and one of them was a young engineer named Reagan Holloway, who had not laughed when the others laughed. She was watching the car, specifically the rear suspension geometry, and her expression had shifted from idle observation to something more concentrated. She had seen those mounting points before, not on a physical car, but in a set of experimental drawings that had been passed around at an engineering conference 4 years ago. Drawings from a project that was supposed to have disappeared. She crossed the lot quickly and caught Cade before he reached the holding area. She asked him quietly who had built the rear suspension on that car, because she had never seen that configuration outside of one set of documents, and those documents belonged to a man named Nolan Mercer. Cade had found the car 8 months earlier at a salvage yard outside Tucson, run by a man named Tucker Briggs, who sold parts the way other people sold memories, meaning reluctantly and at prices that assumed sentiment. The car had been sitting under a canvas tarp in the back corner of the lot for what Tucker estimated was close to 4 years, left behind when a racing project collapsed and nobody came back for it. Tucker had tried to strip it for parts twice, and both times run into fasteners and panel configurations that required tools he did not own, so it had stayed. He sold it to Cade for $500, because $500 was better than the effort of dragging it to the crusher, and because Cade had fixed his irrigation pump twice without charging him full rate. Cade had not intended to rebuild it. His garage behind the house he rented in a dry valley south of Phoenix was small and already full of the kind of work that paid, mostly field vehicles and old utility trucks owned by ranchers and contractors who could not afford new and could not afford to be without. He had meant to strip dustfall the same way Tucker had meant to, pull the useful components, resell them, put $300 or $400 toward the bill that sat on his kitchen table with the word "Past due" stamped in red across the top. That bill was from a hospital, and it was from a year ago, and it was not shrinking. He had a daughter named Molly who was 10 years old, and who trusted him with the uncomplicated totality that children reserve for the people they have decided are capable of anything. She did her homework at the kitchen table and drew pictures at the workbench when he let her, and she had been the one to look at the stripped, rust-striped frame of the car and give it a name: Dustfall. She had drawn it on a notepad with a purple marker, given it a pair of wings and a caption that said, "Not junk, just waiting," and taped it to the garage wall where Cade would see it every time he looked up from whatever he was taking apart. What made him look more carefully at the car was a sound. He was pulling the engine mount bolts, and one of them made a vibration when he struck it, not the hollow rattle of corroded metal, but something denser, more precise, the note of a part that had been engineered rather than just manufactured. He put the wrench down and started tracing, slowly, the way a mechanic does when the work stops being routine and starts being a question. The frame was light in a way that did not match the material gauge. The suspension pickups were in positions that did not follow any production geometry he had seen. The cooling lines ran to points in the chassis that had no corresponding inlet and outlet on the engine block, meaning they connected to something else, something that had not been installed yet or had been removed, and the channels were sealed but not blocked. He found the drawings in a sealed tube wedged inside the secondary frame rail, wrapped in oilcloth that had kept them dry and legible. They were detailed technical drawings, hand-drafted with the kind of density that meant the person who made them did not believe in separate documents for separate concepts. Everything on one page if it could fit, cross-referenced with a notation system he had to work out over 3 evenings. They were signed in the corner with initials, NM, and a date 11 years old. He did not know the name then. He found it 6 weeks later when he started asking around, quietly, through the network of older mechanics and retired fabricators who remembered the desert racing circuit before the money got big. Nolan Mercer had been a designer and fabricator who worked mostly outside the mainstream teams, the kind of engineer who took contracts for cash, never had a website, and was known in specific circles as the person you called when what you wanted was impossible or inadvisable. He had spent the last years of his career working on what people in those circles called his strange car, a desert runner built on principles he had developed over a decade of watching expensive machines fail in hot conditions and cheap machines survive because their owners understood them better than the manufacturers did. The project had been funded briefly, then defunded, then quietly buried. Nolan had died 3 years ago, before he ever finished it. What he had finished was the frame, the suspension geometry, and the design for a passive cooling system that used the car's own motion through heated air to regulate engine temperature without auxiliary components, lighter than any active cooling setup, and more reliable precisely because it had fewer parts that could fail. The engine Cade installed was not from the drawings. It was a rebuilt unit he had sourced himself, matched to the cooling architecture as closely as the drawings allowed. When he ran it for the first time in his driveway at 11 at night, Molly standing in the doorway in her pajamas, because she had heard the engine from her bedroom, the sound it made was low and even and confident, not the sound of an experiment, but the sound of something that had been waiting. He had not planned to race it. The plan had been to document it, find whoever held Nolan's estate, and try to sell the design. Then he saw the registration notice for the Red Hollow 500 and the $10 million prize, and he sat at the kitchen table for a long time looking at the hospital bill and the utilities notice and the property tax statement that had arrived that same week, and he thought about what Molly had written on the wall. Not junk, just waiting. He registered the next morning. Reagan Holloway had a way of speaking about mechanical systems that sounded like she was describing people she had strong feelings about, which was not entirely inaccurate as a characterization of how she understood them. She had spent 3 years working for Drake Velocity Racing as a data analyst and dynamics engineer, and she had left 8 months ago because she had been asked, on 3 separate occasions, to omit specific findings from technical reports when those findings suggested that a competitor's approach might be more efficient than the company's own. She had not been fired. She had simply reached the point where staying required becoming someone she did not want to be, and she had left. She was at the Red Hollow selection event as an independent technical observer, credentialed through the race series to evaluate safety compliance for the smaller teams that could not afford full inspections. When she looked at Dustfall's rear suspension, she saw the mounting points immediately, the unusual offset angle, the secondary pivot that did not correspond to any production configuration she had cataloged in 3 years of professional data work. She had seen that configuration in one place. A set of digitized drawings that had circulated briefly among a small community of engineering enthusiasts after Nolan Mercer's death. Drawings that most people in that community had assumed were theoretical. She told Cade what she knew. He listened without interrupting, which she later said was one of the things that told her he was a real mechanic rather than someone performing the idea of one. When she finished, he nodded once and said he had the original documents, the physical drawings, and offered to show her. She looked at them for 40 minutes in the back of his truck and did not speak for most of that time. The ban on Cade's participation was procedurally thin, as Cassidy Monroe made clear when she introduced herself the following morning. Cassidy was a sports event attorney who had spent 12 years working motorsport dispute proceedings, and she had a gift for identifying the difference between a rule and the enforcement of a preference dressed as a rule. She told the selection committee that there was no provision in the Red Hollow 500 technical regulations that allowed exclusion based on acquisition cost or vehicle aesthetics, that Cade had a right to a full technical inspection, and that if the committee denied that inspection, they would be doing so without procedural foundation, which was a position she would be happy to make formal if they preferred to conduct the conversation that way. The committee gave Cade a 5-mile evaluation run on an access road at the edge of the facility. Savannah lobbied against it with the particular fluency of someone who understood that the argument had already been lost and was trying to at least shape the conditions. She told 2 journalists beforehand that the run would confirm what everyone already knew. That sentiment was not engineering, and that the desert would not be impressed by a good story. Cade pulled Dustfall to the start line and sat for a moment with his hands in his lap, listening. The engine was running rough at idle, a slightly uneven beat that had been there since he replaced the fuel injector seal 2 days ago. He adjusted the rail pressure by memory, made a minor correction to the idle control, and felt the beat smooth out. The observers had their timing equipment ready. He drove. The first half-mile was unremarkable. The car was not the fastest thing on the road that morning and did not pretend to be. But at the mile mark, when the surface shifted to the looser aggregate that characterized the race's actual course, something changed. The car did not fight the surface the way the others had during earlier runs that day. It read it. Cade was not overriding the desert. He was in conversation with it, adjusting pressure and angle in increments so small they were barely visible from outside the car, and the result was a line that stayed true while other machines had left lateral scars in the sand from correction and counter-correction. At mile 3, a Drake Velocity test vehicle that had been running a parallel calibration pass began overheating and pulled to the shoulder. Dustfall continued. At mile 5, Cade brought the car across the timing line at a pace that placed it firmly within the competitive window for endurance-class desert running. Reagan pulled the thermal data from the sensors she had attached before the run, looked at it for 90 seconds, and told the technical committee that the car's heat management numbers were better than anything she had logged in 3 years at a professional operation. Savannah said nothing for almost a full minute. Then she asked for a full mechanical audit, suggesting that the performance indicated possible use of unapproved components. The committee reminded her that the audit was part of the standard process. They opened the hood. There were no unapproved components. There was a rebuilt engine, a handmade cooling channel system documented in drawings that were 11 years old, and the kind of careful fabrication that comes from a person who has more knowledge than budget and has learned to make those things equivalent. The committee approved Cade's entry into the Red Hollow 500. He drove Dustfall back to the secondary lot and sat in it for a moment before getting out, then called Molly on his phone and told her he was in. The offer came that same evening, delivered in person in the way that real offers always are, when the person making them wants to observe the reaction rather than just receive the response. Savannah found Cade at the secondary lot, alone, making small adjustments to the wheel alignment with a measuring string and 2 reference blocks. She came without her team, which was its own kind of statement, and she sat on the edge of the trailer and said she wanted to talk. She had changed her approach entirely, which Cade noted without commenting on. The dismissal of the morning had been replaced with something that almost resembled collegiality, the particular warmth of a person who has decided that you are worth engaging now that you have demonstrated value. She told him she understood the financial pressure of running independently, that she had a lot of respect for what he had accomplished with limited resources, and that she wanted to make him an offer that solved his problem cleanly. $250,000, cash purchase of the car, and a position in the Drake Velocity Maintenance Division that would pay twice what she estimated he was currently making. Cade asked her what she intended to do with the car. She said the team would study it, which both of them understood to mean retire it. He told her it was not for sale. She increased the offer to $1 million. And said she wanted him to understand that she was not trying to diminish what he had done, but to protect him from the outcome she believed was coming. Because a single independent operator, without proper team infrastructure, without adequate backup components, without the kind of deep logistics support that a desert run of this distance required, was going to face problems that his talent could not solve. Cade thought about what she said for a moment, because some of it was true. He had the car, and he had his knowledge, and he had 3 people willing to help him, which was everything he had ever needed for the kind of work he did. But the Red Hollow 500 was not a local field repair. It was 500 miles of terrain that could dismantle even well-funded operations. He thanked her for the offer and told her again that the car was not for sale, that he had not come here to become a case study in what money could buy, and that he was going to race. She left the lot without a response, and Cade spent the rest of the night on the alignment. Weston Hale had driven up in a 20-year-old camper van and parked it at the edge of the secondary lot 2 days earlier, which was how he operated, arriving before things got complicated so he could observe how they developed. He was 58 years old and had won 11 desert races in a career that ended not with a dramatic crash but with a knee injury sustained getting out of a vehicle, which he said was more representative of how most things actually ended than people liked to admit. He had known Nolan Mercer through the circuit, had driven one of Nolan's modified chassis in a regional race 17 years ago, and finished 3rd in conditions that had eliminated everyone running factory equipment. He sat on his bumper with coffee and looked at dustfall for a long time after Savannah left, then told Cade that the car was what Nolan had always said it would be, which was not the fastest, but the most honest. He said that Nolan's entire theory of desert racing was that the cars which failed always failed the same way, which was by lying, by telling the driver they had more capacity than they did, by performing confidence until the desert called the bluff. Nolan had wanted to build a car that could not lie, where the driver always knew exactly what they had. He asked if he could help. Cade said yes. Reagan was already there. Cassidy had her phone and her documentation. The 4 of them sat on mismatched chairs in the secondary lot and planned, and it was the kind of planning that looked like nothing from the outside but felt, to the people doing it, entirely sufficient. The preparation happened in a rented bay at the far end of the facility's maintenance complex, a space Cassidy had secured through the event's independent operator provision after the primary team bays were allocated. It was not large and it was not equipped with anything beyond basic infrastructure, but it was theirs, and they worked in it the way people work in spaces they have earned rather than inherited. Reagan focused on the suspension tuning, working from Nolan's drawings and from the sensor data collected during the qualification run. The rear geometry was already optimized for flat, high-speed desert, but the Red Hollow course included a significant rocky section in the third quarter that would require different damper settings, or the car would lose traction exactly when Cade needed it most. She worked through the night with two adjustment tools and a set of calculations done on a legal pad, and by morning she had a configuration that she believed would split the difference effectively. Weston took Cade through the course section by section, not from memory but from his own notes compiled over years of watching other drivers succeed and fail on each terrain type. He explained the wind behavior in the canyon corridor at mile 240, where a crosswind that felt manageable at 40 miles per hour became dangerous at 60 because of the way the valley walls compressed and redirected it. He explained the soft crust lake bed at mile 380, which looked solid from above, but would accept a wheel if the pressure was wrong and could end a run in 3 seconds. He explained the rock garden at mile 410, which the fast lines all went through, but which had destroyed transmissions and front suspension assemblies on $50,000 components. The right line through the rocks was not the shortest. It was the one that kept the wheels in contact long enough for the chassis to absorb rather than resist. Cade adjusted the engine tune himself, working by sound and feel in the way that had always served him better than instrumentation, a diagnostic sense developed over 20 years of mechanical work that allowed him to hear problems before they appeared in data. He found a minor harmonic in the secondary fuel circuit at mid-range throttle, traced it to a mounting resonance in the line bracket, and corrected it with a rubber isolator he cut from a strip of material he carried in his toolbox for exactly that kind of improvisation. Molly called the evening before the race and asked if he was scared. He told her he was ready, which he had learned was more accurate and more useful than scared or not scared. She told him she had drawn a new picture of dustfall, with dust coming off the tires and the number on the door made bigger, and that she had put it on the refrigerator so the house would remember what was happening even while he was gone. He laughed, and the laugh was real, the kind that comes from being known rather than from finding something funny. He told her he would bring the car home, and he meant the car and himself both, and she understood that. Reagan found the cooling annotation late that evening, a cluster of symbols in the lower corner of the fourth drawing that she had read as a material specification, but that Cade recognized when she showed him as a valve sequence. There was a secondary air channel in the chassis that they had both assumed was a structural element. It was not. It was a passive flow regulator designed to open at a specific temperature differential and route ambient air across the lower portion of the engine block, adding cooling capacity without any pump or active component, purely through the movement of the car and the physics of pressure differential. The channel was sealed but intact. They spent 2 hours removing the plug and confirming the pathway was clear, and when Reagan recalculated the thermal projections with the channel active, the numbers changed significantly. Savannah had arranged for a runner to observe the secondary lot from a discrete distance during preparation. The runner reported back that Cade's team was small, working by hand, and spending a lot of time looking at old drawings. Savannah's technical director told her this confirmed his assessment that the qualification performance was likely a statistical anomaly and that 500 miles would normalize the outcome. She adjusted her team's race strategy to emphasize high early speed to build a lead that would be psychologically difficult for a smaller operation to pursue, believing that if she could establish 30 minutes of cushion in the first 150 miles, Cade would either break trying to close the gap or accept a distant finish position. She did not factor in that Cade had already decided not to race the first 150 miles. The start of the Red Hollow 500 was announced by a flare fired from the ridge above the staging area at 5:42 in the morning. The sky still dark in the west and pinkening in the east, and 41 vehicles launched into the desert with a sound like a single enormous thing waking up and immediately disagreeing with itself. Dustfall left the line in the lower third of the pack, which was where Cade had positioned it deliberately, because the opening section ran through a narrow corridor where the cars jostling for early position generated the most mechanical stress and the most risk for the least gain. The Drake Velocity primary vehicle was in the lead before the first mile marker, exactly as Savannah had planned, and the broadcast team gave it the kind of sustained attention that money and familiarity reliably produce. There were 40 other stories developing simultaneously in the desert that morning, but the cameras followed the front of the race, which meant they followed Savannah's machine, and occasionally, when nothing more prominent was happening, cut to the middle of the pack where a sun-faded car was running an unremarkable line through easy terrain. Weston was monitoring from a support position with radio access, and his communications with Cade over the first 50 miles consisted almost entirely of one instruction, delivered at intervals. "You are exactly where you should be." Cade heard it and stayed there. He had driven trucks and utility vehicles and old beaters on desert roads since he was 17 years old, and he understood that the desert was not a track. It was a conversation, and like all conversations, it went badly when one party tried to dominate it rather than read it. At mile 83, the ambient temperature climbed past what the morning forecast had predicted. A 10-degree overshoot driven by a weather system that had moved faster than the models expected. The cars running at high speed felt this first, and most acutely, because sustained high throttle generates heat internally while high speed generates cooling airflow, and the balance between those two shifts in a way that is not always visible until a system approaches its limit. Reagan was tracking this from the support point and told Cade the temperature delta was significant. Cade had felt it already, had been feeling the way Dustfall's engine note changed by fractions as the external temperature rose, and he adjusted his throttle discipline accordingly. At mile 112, a secondary Drake Velocity vehicle, one of 3 that Savannah had entered under affiliated team designations to spread the field and maximize her operations chances, pulled off the course with what the team's radio traffic described as a cooling failure. This was the first visible evidence of what the data had been suggesting for the previous 30 miles, that the conditions were punishing systems that had been optimized for controlled test track temperatures rather than the less predictable desert reality. Dustfall's passive channel was doing what Nolan had designed it to do, which was nothing dramatic, just a steady, invisible management of the temperature differential that kept the engine operating in its comfort range while the engines around it began to argue with the heat. Reagan watched the sensor readouts and said nothing about it on the radio, because there was nothing to say. The numbers were exactly what they should be. Cade moved up 15 positions between mile 100 and mile 250 without a single aggressive pass. He did not need aggression. He needed patience, and patience was the one resource he had in quantities the expensive operations could not match because it did not cost anything. At the halfway point, Dustfall was running 10th. Savannah heard this from her technical director and, for the first time that morning, said nothing. The mandatory service stop in the middle of the event lasted 40 minutes, and Savannah used 30 of those minutes attempting to get Cade removed from the race. The mechanism she chose was a technical objection, formally submitted to the race stewards, alleging that the cooling channel in Dustfall's chassis represented an unapproved design modification that had not been declared during technical inspection. Cassidy Monroe was at the service area because she had anticipated this and positioned herself accordingly. and she had the documentation ready before the steward finished reading the objection. She submitted the original Nolan Mercer drawings, dated 11 years prior, the technical inspection report from the qualification run, confirming all components had been evaluated and approved, and a formal response noting that the cooling channel had been open and visible during inspection, and that no examiner had raised any objection to it at that time, meaning the objection was either an acknowledgement that the initial inspection had been inadequate, which was the committee's responsibility rather than Cade's, or it was procedurally void. Weston, while this was being resolved, asked to see the document Savannah had submitted as supporting evidence for her claim, and Cassidy obtained it through the steward process. It was a summary of the circumstances surrounding Nolan Mercer's project, framing the withdrawal of funding as evidence that the design had been rejected for safety reasons. Weston had been in the circuit during that period, and he remembered the actual circumstances with precision. The project had not been defunded for safety reasons. It had been defunded because a senior technical advisor for one of the major sponsors had looked at Nolan's cost projections and realized that a car built on these principles would be too durable, requiring too few replacement components, generating too little demand for the parts and service contracts that made the sponsorship ecosystem profitable. The safety concern had been manufactured for the documentation. The actual concern had been that Nolan was building something that was not commercially exploitable in the way the industry required. When Weston presented this to the steward, with the names of the people involved and the meeting at which the decision had been made, the steward looked at the document again and then looked at Savannah for a long moment. The objection was dismissed. Cassidy noted formally that the submission of a materially inaccurate document in a steward proceeding was a compliance matter that the race's governing body would want to review following the event. Savannah understood what this meant. She returned to her team's service area, and Cade used the remaining 11 minutes of the service stop to fix the small crack in the secondary fuel bracket that he had found only because she had forced him to stop. He thanked her for that on his way back to the car, and meant it sincerely. The storm came in from the northwest at mile 360, ahead of every forecast that had been available at the start line that morning. Desert dust events move on their own logic, and they announce themselves not gradually but all at once. A wall of suspended particulate appearing on the horizon with the suddenness of a curtain drop, and then the visibility goes from miles to yards in under 2 minutes. Cade had driven in dust before. Weston had been warning him about this section of the course for 3 days, the northwest exposure, the way the valley geometry amplified the wind's velocity and carried material from the dry lake beds further north, and when Reagan came over the radio and said the storm is early and it is large, Cade already had his pace adjusted. The expensive car's navigation systems began to struggle with the magnetic interference that the particulate generated, and drivers who had been relying on those systems to maintain their lines started making corrections based on data that was 2 or 3 seconds old, which in a vehicle moving at speed across irregular terrain is enough lag to generate significant problems. 2 cars from the second position group hit the same depression in the surface at close interval, neither seeing the other in the reduced visibility, and both were forced to stop and assess damage. A third car's air filtration system, rated for controlled conditions, reached saturation and triggered an engine protective shutdown. Cade navigated by the methods Weston had taught him, which were older than electronic systems and more reliable in conditions that defeated them. Wind direction sensed through the car's resistance and the pressure differential across the windshield. Surface texture read through the steering column and the suspension feedback. The angle of the light through the dust on the rare occasions it was visible, relative to the time of day. the positions of rock formations he had memorized from the maps they had studied over 5 evenings in the secondary lot. He was not fast. He was accurate, and in conditions where fast had become dangerous and dangerous had become expensive, accuracy was the only currency that held its value. He was in 3rd position when the storm reached its peak density. Reagan called him over the radio and told him that based on the course data Nolan had annotated, there was a historical crossing route through the dry lake bed to the east, 11 miles shorter than the primary course line and last used by a vehicle 30 years ago, before the modern race infrastructure existed. She said that Nolan had flagged it in the drawings, marked it as viable for vehicles with correctly distributed weight and sufficient suspension travel, and that Dustfall's geometry matched the requirements Nolan had described exactly. She also said the crossing would not be visible from the primary course, and that no other team knew it existed. Cade held the wheel and thought. The route was shorter. It was also untested for 3 decades, and desert terrain in that time could have changed in ways that made a historical notation meaningless. If he took the crossing and found an obstacle, or if the surface had shifted in the intervening years, he would be alone in a dust storm on a route that no support vehicle could reach in time. The conservative calculation said stay on the primary course and finish 3rd, which was still a significant result, which was still money, which was still a future for Molly. He looked at the drawing she had made, taped to the lower portion of the dashboard below the instruments, the car with its oversized number and the dust coming off the tires, and the words she had put in a small cloud above it that he had not noticed until he was 50 miles from the start line that morning. She had written, "He knows what the car can do." He turned east. The crossing was rough in the way that Weston's experience suggested it would be, and Reagan's calculations confirmed it could be handled, and Dustfall handled it the way a well-prepared car handles terrain it was designed for, which is to say without drama and without grace. Just the steady mechanical conversation between a machine and a surface that have been made to understand each other. The suspension traveled fully, the cooling channel did its work, the engine ran where it needed to run and did not complain about the demands being made of it. Cade drove it the way he drove everything, by listening, which is to say, by caring about what the car was telling him rather than what he wanted it to say. He emerged from the crossing onto the primary course 2 miles from the final approach, and Dustfall was leading the race. The Drake Velocity primary vehicle was 3 miles behind him, its engine running hot enough that the driver had dropped speed to protect it, and Savannah was on the radio to her driver using the word unacceptable in a way that communicated clearly that she had confused the word with a mechanical directive, as though the car's temperature gauge could be corrected by her disapproval. The driver finished the race in 2nd position, and the engine was declared damaged beyond economic repair at the post-race inspection. Cade crossed the finish line first with a margin of 8 minutes, brought the car to a stop in the winner's enclosure, and sat in it for a moment with his hands resting on the wheel and the engine ticking as it cooled. Then he picked up the radio and told Reagan and Weston and Cassidy that he was done. And the word carried everything he meant by it, which was that the car had done what it was designed to do, and so had he, and now he was going to go home. The coverage that followed was of the kind that requires no promotion because the story told itself, and the story was this. A 39-year-old independent mechanic and single father from outside Phoenix had entered the most demanding desert race in North America in a vehicle purchased for $500 and rebuilt in a private garage, and had won $10 million. The story had the mathematical perfection of something people want to be true, which is the most durable kind of news, and it spread the way those stories do, completely and immediately. Savannah issued a statement attributing her team's result to the unusual weather conditions, and noting that equipment decisions made in advance of a race cannot fully account for variables that develop on the day. The statement was accurate in its facts and dishonest in its implications, which was characteristic of how she had managed most difficult communications in her career, and it worked for approximately 48 hours, which was how long it took for Cassidy's formal filing with the race's governing body to become public record. The filing documented the qualification objection, the false representation in the steward's submission regarding Nolan Mercer's project termination, and several additional items that Reagan had provided based on her direct experience during her 3 years at Drake Velocity, including instances of selective data omission in technical reports and 2 cases of competitor surveillance conducted through unofficial channels. The governing body opened a formal investigation. 2 of Savannah's major sponsors suspended their agreements pending the outcome. 3 senior technical staff from Drake Velocity resigned in the same week, releasing statements that varied in their specificity but converged on a shared theme, which was that they had been asked to operate below the standards of the profession they had chosen. Savannah remained in her role through the investigation's initial phase, but the operational reality of the company changed significantly. The way the operational reality of any enterprise changes when the people who do the actual work decide they are no longer willing to subordinate their judgment to someone else's image management. Cade was not party to any of this in any active sense. He was in Arizona. At the post-race ceremony, when a journalist asked him to characterize the experience of beating multi-million-dollar machines with a $500 car, he said that the car had not beaten anything because the car was not cheap, it was accurate, and that the difference between cheap and accurate was the same as the difference between what something costs and what it is worth. He said this without emphasis, as a statement of fact, and it was quoted in the coverage more than anything else he said that week. Vaughn Mercer, who administered the estate and papers of Nolan Mercer, found Cade at the ceremony through Weston's contact and introduced himself. He confirmed that the drawings Cade had found were authentic, that they were the last complete technical document from Nolan's final project, and that Nolan had believed to the end of his life that the car would eventually be built by someone who needed to build it more than they needed to be known for building it. He said he thought Nolan would have been satisfied by the outcome, and that satisfied was the highest evaluation Nolan had applied to anything. Cade used a portion of the prize money to establish a fund in Nolan Mercer's name, administered through a small motorsport charity organization, providing grants to independent mechanics, small team builders, and engineering students who were pursuing work outside the commercial mainstream. He named it the Mercer Desert Engineering Fund and gave it a modest initial endowment and a clear mandate, which was to support people who understood machines well enough to see the value in things others had written off. The garage in Arizona was renovated over the following months, not expanded dramatically but made solid in the ways it had not been before. A new lift, proper lighting, an enclosed storage area for documentation and materials. The house next door was purchased, the same house Cade had been renting, and paid for in full, which was a transaction so unlike anything in his previous financial experience that he stood in the county recorder's office for a full minute holding the copy of the deed before he put it in his jacket pocket and drove home. Dustfall stood in the center of the garage, on a dedicated section of fresh epoxy floor. Cade had cleaned it and done a mechanical review, replaced the components that had worn at the upper edge of their tolerance during the race, repainted the numbers on the door in the same color they had been, which was a hand-mixed red that was slightly too orange, because that was the color they had been, and because changing it felt like revising a document that had already been submitted and accepted. The hairline crack in the windshield was still sealed with resin. The door that had been caved in and straightened remained with its slight imperfection visible under direct light. Molly had added a sticker below the door number, small and slightly crooked because she had applied it herself. Not junk, just waiting. He took consulting calls from 3 racing organizations that year and agreed to 2 of them, both smaller independent teams who wanted access to the Mercer documentation under a licensing arrangement that let them develop their own applications of the design principles rather than replicate dustfall directly. He declined an offer from a large automotive manufacturer who wanted to acquire the full documentation set and develop a commercial product from it, not because he was hostile to the idea in principle, but because the terms of the acquisition would have removed the documentation from public access, which was the opposite of what Nolan had intended when he put it in a sealed tube inside a frame rail and let it wait for someone to find it. Molly turned 11 that fall and asked if they could take Dustfall on a drive, not a race, just out into the desert on a Saturday morning while the temperature was still reasonable. Cade made sure the car was mechanically sound, filled the fuel cell, and drove it out of the garage for the first time since the transport back from Nevada. They took the access road that ran south toward the open flats, the same kind of terrain the car had been designed for, and Molly sat in the passenger seat with her feet on the floorboard and watched the landscape pass through the cracked and resin-sealed windshield. She asked whether Dustfall would race again. Cade considered this for a moment, keeping his eyes on the road, his hands easy on the wheel in the way of someone who has stopped needing to perform confidence, because confidence has become a condition rather than a performance. He said maybe. But right now, he said, all the car needs to do is take us home. The desert was the same desert it had always been, patient and indifferent and immense, and the car moved through it the way it had been designed to, not with speed but with honesty, and behind them the dust settled back onto the road in the slow, unhurried way of things that have been waiting a long time and have learned not to be in a hurry about anything at all.